Okay guys, so let's talk about Afghanistan. We're all watching in horror and disbelief as events unfold. As we know, after a 20-year presence, American forces departed and the Taliban took over the country with breathtaking speed. Many of you have asked me to explain what happened, and as I was thinking about it, there are so many angles that we could tell this story. We could talk about the humanitarian aspect, which in my view is the most dire. My heart is broken for the allies who risked their lives to work with us, many of whom have now been left behind. And of course, the countless of girls and young women who are now in harm's way. We can talk about what went wrong. We can talk about why we were even there to begin with. We could talk about the corruption, both on the part of the Afghan government, but also on our part, about the military-industrial complex that continues to drive our foreign policy. All of these are very important, yet remarkably complex topics that are beyond the scope of what I can offer. I'm watching this unfold, the same time as you. So all I can say is, as you're doing your own research, be wary of one-sided explanations and simple answers. Because one thing that I do know for sure is that this is far from simple. I'm going to include a list of what I've been reading and watching that covers some of these topics and more. But for this video, I'm not going to cover what's happening right now. There are plenty of journalists doing great work breaking that down for us in real time. I've decided to focus on what I do best, the history. See, most accounts that you're going to find on the US and Afghanistan start with 9/11, but in reality, it goes back way farther than that. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Mujahideen. So on August 15th, armed Taliban fighters entered the presidential palace in Kabul, but there was no bloodshed. The president of the friendly government we had supported had already fled the country. And while those of us abroad were shocked, it's actually not that surprising when you take a look at the long history of Afghanistan, a country which foreign powers have tried and failed over centuries to conquer. Our story begins in 1979, when a group of local insurgents known as the Mujahideen launched a guerrilla war to overthrow the wildly unpopular communist government at the time. Now, 1970s, communist, that should give you a clue as to where we're going with this. If you thought Cold War, ding ding, you're right. And you better believe that the Soviets and the Americans got involved. Concerned that the government would turn to the Americans under the pressure of the insurgency, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. They assassinated the leader and they replaced him with a more loyal one. The Soviet-Afghan War lasted 9 years, during which the Americans played a quiet but crucial role. The CIA program, codenamed Operation Cyclone, was actually one of the longest and most expensive covert CIA operations ever undertaken. More than $20 billion in US funds was funneled into the country via Pakistan to train and arm Afghan resistance groups. Now, Pakistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, China, and the UK also supplied weapons and resources. The international community, Western and Arab nations included, was by and large opposed to the Soviet invasion. They issued tons of resolutions and sanctions and boycotts. It took a while, but eventually the Soviets capitulated and they withdrew in February 1989. Now, the Berlin Wall fell in November and the Soviet Union collapsed shortly after, so you could say it was a pretty bad year for them. The Americans, on the other hand, they were quite pleased with this outcome. What they didn't know at the time was how it would come back to bite them. So, following Soviet departure, the Mujahideen established the government. But see, it didn't last very long because there were a ton of different factions within it that eventually tore it apart from the inside. Now, one of these factions was led by a former Mujahideen commander who broke away and formed the Taliban. Amidst the chaos, Afghanistan became this kind of safe haven for Islamic extremist groups across the Middle East, many of whom joined the Taliban, and eventually that's the group that won out and took control of the country. The US relationship with Afghanistan over the next few years was tense, to say the least. The US refused to recognize the Taliban as the legitimate government of Afghanistan and rather considered the Northern Alliance, which was the stronghold in the north that maintained a resistance to the Taliban, to be the legitimate government. Interestingly enough, as of the time I'm recording this video, that province still remains the only part of the country not to fall to the Taliban in this recent takeover. To add insult to injury, there was this guy called Osama bin Laden hiding out in Afghanistan, plotting bad shit like the 1998 US Embassy bombing, starting Al-Qaeda, and issuing fatwas, which is basically a declaration of war against the US. Needless to say, the Americans were less than pleased when the Taliban refused to kick him out, citing their Pashtunwali code of ethics that guests be offered sanctuary. Then came 9/11, and that changed everything. The US invaded Afghanistan with a dual mission to kill bin Laden and other Al-Qaeda members, as well as remove the Taliban from power. And that lasted until, well, now. Now that I've brought you up to speed, and keep in mind this is a very, very condensed version, I hope that you can start to look at the next 20 years that followed. There's a ton of information out there, and I encourage you to learn as much as you can and form your own opinions. We have a lot of time, though, to learn, debate, and determine where our votes lie when it comes to foreign policy. Right now, however, there are people in Afghanistan who desperately need our help. These are people who risked their lives for us. They've worked alongside us, and they believed in us, and they trusted us. And we have a moral obligation not to turn our backs on them. So, before I share my recommendations for further reading, here's a list of ways that you can help below.